there's a difference between property and an asset, but, this is not something that normal people, can understand. Really, it's that, the ultimate thing is that the children have a property in visiting their parents, and the parents have a property in visiting their children. But, I don't mean to be technical. I just mean to say that, if we're even here as a society, something is really wrong, because people shouldn't have to be trying to claw their way up to the due process that an inanimate object would have. And this is just unbelievable that our country's gotten to this point. I mean, that should be a given. I mean, we shouldn't have a situation where if someone having civil litigation about a can of soda, is enjoying more due process rights than someone who is having their children taken away from them.
Yeah, and when you're considering something as devastating as splitting up a family, due process seems like it would be crucial. Versus just the preponderance of evidence, which is the current standard in the juvenile courts.
I think one of the failures where this got started was they somehow think they're doing a deal. But let's look at juvenile hall. Okay, so let's say you have like a 12-year-old kid who allegedly makes a death threat to somebody on the telephone. Now, if they do this, first of all, there's a good chance that no one has any good evidence to prove it anyway, because of the way things are with telephones. Because it's kind of hard to tell who's using a telephone at any given moment. But anyhow, the way they looked at this in the past in due process is that they think that they're like making a deal with the child, that the court's making a deal with the child, that the child gets to waive all his criminal due process if he'll just submit himself to the juvenile code. And so then the juvenile code is like an alternative where you're being committed in a civil sense instead of in a criminal sense. And so they just swap the criminal law with civil law, and then they act like it's a civil law thing to go commit someone to jail for however many years, or to the juvenile hall. And I think people got to get to the point where they realize that whenever you're doing something with arresting someone or compelling someone or something that might be imprisoning, but for lack of authority, whenever they're doing anything with persons, they got to get the idea that you need a criminal standard of evidence. I mean, it's not right that someone can say can make a lie about something that happened to a child. Right? I mean, you have cases where, like, a nurse will feel she's a mandatory reporter that someone walked away while their kids were in the car, with a cold or something like that. They walked away and did go buy medicine for like 10 minutes. And a nurse feels she's a mandatory reporter and she's got to call that in, right? And this is the kind of tyranny that's been tolerated where they'll have children be taken away. And I'm sure everybody knows this already is in this audience, but they have children taken away for these temporary, what do they call those? I mean, I don't know much about the due process of CPS specifically, but I know in the hospital they call it a temporary hold, but they have, emergency orders outside of the hospital, is that right?
Yeah.
But whatever the order is, whatever the writ of attachment is, whatever the process is, the bottom line is they're basically arresting that child on criminal charges. And people have got to get that in their mind. Mm-hmm. And they're arresting the parent, too. The parent and the child together are one unit.
They essentially become a ward of the state.
Right. And because they're one unit, they have to be, treated in a way that, like, they have to be Mirandized. I mean, this is the way things really should be. But they have it now worked out now so that they think everything's done in a civil sense, like they're arguing about property or something, and they made it even worse than that. So, these codes are just so oppressive, and I think as long as people are just letting it happen, and there's no, I think the most important thing we can do for due process is get the word out that, the blood is on your head if you're someone in the gallery and you're one of the people of the state, you're the people of the United States, you guys let all this stuff happen. And if you're not doing anything to stop it, this is what you get. You get a tyrannical government.
Yeah, and
people have got to own it. You got to fight privatization with owning the problem.
And they've
people have to own the problem.
They've weaponized CPS to such a degree to where, these social workers are becoming like gang stalkers or mandated reporters online, and they target children and families. A mandated reporter is a person who is, because of his profession, he or she is legally required to report a suspicion of child abuse or neglect to the authorities. And these laws are supposedly in place to prevent children from being abused and to end possible abuse and neglect at the earliest stage possible. However, quite often, sometimes there's just situations, especially with children. But, a mandated reporter can be a teacher, hospital, a nurse, librarian, anybody that comes into contact with vulnerable people or children.
It creates all kinds of conflicts because, there's situations where if it was in a criminal law sense, you would say that, there was no probable cause. And there's a cause for distinctions like that. But, it creates a situation where people feel they have to report when things they shouldn't report. Mm-hmm. That's the problem. And there used to be a misprison, and I think that the misprison charges, if they just developed that better, it would be more accurate than just throwing statutes and codes at everything. But they've had problems with that because of the First Amendment rights to not speak and things like that. So they usually just bring the professionals in instead of everyday citizens, and they say that the professionals, like as if it was a condition of their licensure, their professional licensing, that they have to be a mandatory reporter. Mm-hmm. It would be a lot better if they just kept on misprison, because misprison would be making a misdemeanor not to report a felony you see happen, right? And abandoning a child on a doorstep, for example, is felonious, I think. Depending on the circumstances. When you have things like that happening, like in the cold and things like that.
Why do you suppose that we see so many violations of due process in the courts? For example, the Schaefer-Cox case.
Well, when we look at Schaefer-Cox, the situation is that they just ignorance of the people is the biggest problem. If the people were not ignorant of what the Constitution says, there could be like letter writing campaigns to Congress or something, and this would something would be done to do this right, a retrial or something. And it goes back to what Ben Franklin said when they were adopting the federal Constitution. I believe he said something along the lines that it was a republic. This is a republic if you can keep it. Mm-hmm. And we see that a lot of people haven't worked to keep it. And we have a divided country now. We have a country where people sneer at Alex Jones and say, "Hey, didn't you lose custody of your children?" And so that's just that satanic energy that they're bringing in. Having that satanic satisfaction for something that didn't even happen. They just thought it did because they don't understand how to sort fake news out from news. And, people like that, frankly, don't belong in the jury pool. So we've got a big political problem now with this division.
Yeah, even like a fair and balanced debate, where you explain your perspective. You can disagree with people, and that's totally fine. But anymore, they just cuss at you, and they're just like very aggressive, and there's no resolution, or there's no real debate.
Well, they're just reactionary is the problem. They want to provoke reaction from you, and they just want to go through life reacting like a Pavlov dog or something.
Where do you go from there?
Well, I guess for some people that's it. I mean, you have to wonder how it was in Sodom and Gomorrah. At the end. But what people need to do is they need to understand, that Jesus was there. He died for their sins. People talk about sovereignty, right? If they want a good definition of sovereignty, personal sovereignty, look at what Jesus did. Look at him, getting up on the cross and dying for us. I mean, that's the best definition of sovereignty you could have.
This has been going on forever and ever. I mean, the bullying in the schools, trying to get kids to conform at an earlier age. And then it goes, when you get older, it becomes gang stalking, or it even becomes your family that tries to, encourage you to conform. And then it's always been there under the surface. And it's been this way throughout the ages. I mean, and my point is Jesus was a targeted individual.
I think that's one of the things that's glossed over a lot. I mean, he had to slip through the crowds. He almost got run off a cliff. And, there's plenty of other examples. If you just look there in the 4 Gospels, you'll see them.
So I guess, and then there's this other perception that I'm somehow pro-mothers or pro-fathers. I am neither. I just want to make this clear for the listeners that are tuning in. I no longer believe that it's like more so males that are targeted, or it's, women. I believe that the court has its own agenda, and at its core, it is to liquidate, target, and human traffic.
One of the really sick things that happened in civil procedure back, I think, starting in the late 1980s at the federal level, was they started replacing the word he. Every time they referred to a litigant as a he, they replaced it with it. I think there was a phase there where it was he or she, but then they went to it. So now the litigants are its. Well,
I guess I say that kind of generally, but I mean, when you're going, like, I'm talking about like family court and child protective services court. I'm not.
Well, I just mean the mentality. The mentality is that they don't even understand anything about gender. I mean, it's like you're replacing everything with a robot. You're replacing people with robots. You're replacing God with a robot, I guess, is what they want to do too.
And I've had William Wagner on the show, the host of On Second Thought, and he's like a 27-year court watcher. And he said he guesstimates that it's about 60-40 now, closer to like, even, where, it's not so much, men or women in particular. They have their own agenda, which includes liquidating assets. And if you liquidate all of your assets, you can still be targeted by gang stalkers for human trafficking, which is what happens to the children through Child Protective Services quite often. And then, women often will get targeted online, looking for help. Going through this process, I've witnessed that quite a bit. So, and then, there's these groups that, work together as like, some of them will say that they're advocates or activists in the movement, when in fact, I've realized that some of them actually work with these corrupt judges to target specifically parents sometimes that are winning their cases or getting their children back, getting just a lot of really shady activities I've seen, go down over the years.
People that are causing the problem, and they're getting all this money from people from actually being the cause of the problem. They got to realize they can't take it with them. Mm-hmm. To get back to Schaefer Cox, some of the things that he said, those are things that someone like Edward Cook could have said, who's the Chief Justice in England back in the 1600s. And there's things like George Washington could have said. And, when we think about this